asked Ian Duncan-Smith, with whom Mr Cummings worked as Chief of Staff in the early 2000s, what he thought his ex-aide sought to achieve with this appearance.
I think the aim was to do as much damage to Boris Johnson as possible. Did government make mistakes? Absolutely. Did at times they make what may turn out to be decisions that were the wrong decisions? Yes. But was it all down to the fact that the man that gave the testimony somehow was right at every single point during the course of that, but wasn't listened to? It's just not feasible. And Barnard Castle was the test, because he couldn't bring himself to say he was unquestionably sorry. Everything else in that testimony was all about one target and one target only, and it was the Prime Minister.
It must be said he's been previously scathing about you as well, describing you as incompetent, even a muppet, and someone who had to be kind of got out of the Conservative leadership. I remember actually being at the Conservative Party conference, and you and I were standing together when this avalanche was being sort of kicked off. Does it always end this way with Dominic Cummings?
Yes, it does, because this goes to the heart of his character. He's an intelligent man, and he has often good ideas. He is a disruptor, but at the same time, disrupting is okay, change is important, but managing change and managing the arguments and bringing people with you are vitally important in running a government. And of course, this was not what he really does, and therefore his frustration and his anger that everybody else's belief is stupid, as with me, as with Boris Johnson, nobody is good enough to understand what he really wants, and therefore they are to blame for it.
Dominic Cummings talked about the very difficult time, his words, that Boris Johnson was having in his private life in February last year, when his focus should have been on coronavirus. He was finalising his divorce. His then girlfriend, now fiancée, Carrie Simons, was pregnant, etc. Do you think that domestic instability was a problem for the Prime Minister? Because that does have a serious undertone, doesn't it, of being distracted.
We all have to handle things and crises that happen within families, even while we are running things. The idea that somehow these were peculiar to the Prime Minister, maybe in the extent of them and maybe in a rather complicated life sometimes, but that still doesn't mean you can't focus.
Well, I think the charge that Dominic Cummings was raising was that Boris Johnson wasn't focusing.
Well, maybe, but of course, what is the role of Dominic Cummings as his main political advisor? To structure things around him so that the key moments are dealt with in a structured way, allowing him to focus on the requirements and the decisions that are needed.
What about Boris Johnson's record since? I mean, we're more than a year into the pandemic. A lot of lessons don't look like they're being learnt. If we look at the debate over when India was put on the red list, confusing advice given to various hotspots around the country. I put it like that because I think your account is, if you like, very punitive towards Cummings, and it's quite kind towards the Prime Minister's record.
I come back to the single point. A Prime Minister is often only as good as the structure and the people around him or her, and that is why it is so critical to have a proper, balanced structure, well led. They may have brilliant ideas,
but that's not what Boris Johnson did when he appointed Dominic Cummings, did he? He didn't.
Well, I agree. I always thought that appointment was personally going to end somewhere along this road. You know, what's needed for a Prime Minister is different from what's needed to fight a single issue campaign. Good advice, good structure, proper balance is vital in a Prime Minister's office. And that, if anything, is the single biggest lesson, I suspect, that will be taken out of this, alongside the need for change in the civil service.
Dominic Cummings was harshly critical of the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, repeatedly. He said he should have been fired for at least 15 to 20 things. Do you have full confidence in Matt Hancock?
Well, I don't know all the circumstances inside, but yes, I've dealt with Matt Hancock. I don't know exactly how these things work. We won't know that until we see the full inquiry. But he always seemed to me to be pretty responsive. And, the only question I would ask about this is that if Dominic Cummings has some specific material that he understands where there were specific lies made, then he should make that available, because my personal view is we can all make allegations about people.
Dominic Cummings made this point, which might linger in some minds. It is that tens of thousands of people died unnecessarily because of mistakes in the handling of COVID.
My personal view is, from start to finish, tens of hundreds of thousands, millions of people will have died unnecessarily because of failures everywhere, from China right the way through. I mean, the true horror of all of this is that none of us were prepared for this. None of us understood the nature of how big this threatened pandemic could ever be. We've learnt that harshly, but the truth is we were overwhelmed by what happened. Lessons learned isn't about blaming, it's about making sure we never make the same mistakes again.
Ian Duncan Smith.